Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. Colossians 2:8. In Acts 17, Paul the Apostle came to Athens to preach the gospel, and encountered the philosophers. True wisdom had come to those who had vainly fought and bickered over the truth for generations. It was written, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him, and when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Therefore he disputed in the synagogue with the Jews, and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him. And some said, What will this babbler say? Other some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus, and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto the Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine, whereof thou speakest, is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by, and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. What is the place of philosophy in the Church? Should it be utilized and corrected, or wholly disregarded? Given that all men are made in the image of God as logical, ethical-bound beings, it is natural that even those who have not heard the revelation of God still perceive his being and attributes, albeit with false pagan or vain philosophical baggage. If all truth is God's, then the claims of the philosophers must be examined rationally and exegetically, rather than all the heathen thinkers being entirely wrong. Rather we assert that they are only partially enlightened. Christianity and Jesus Christ is the logos, the mind, the ultimate perfection that the philosophers sought for so long. The early Christian writer, Tertullian of Carthage, rebuked the philosophers as the source of all heresy. These are the doctrines of men and of demons produced for itching ears of the spirit of this world's wisdom. This the Lord called foolishness, and chose the foolish things of this world to confound even philosophy itself. For it is which is the material of the world's wisdom, the rash interpreter of the nature and the dispensation of God. Indeed, heresies are themselves instigated by philosophy. From this source came the aeons, and I know not what infinite forms, and the Trinity of man, and the school of Valentinus, who was of Plato's school. From the same source came Marcion's better God, with all his tranquility. He came of the Stoics. Then again, the opinion that the soul dies is held by the Epicureans, while the denial of the restoration of the body is taken from the aggregate school of all the philosophers. Also, when matter is made equal to God, then you have the teaching of Zeno. O unhappy Aristotle, who invented for these men dialectics, the art of building up and pulling down, an art so evasive in its propositions, so far-fetched in its conjectures, so harsh in its judgments, so productive of contentions, embarrassing even to itself. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Prescription against heretics. The Socratic philosophical outgrowths, skepticism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism, all existed in the Greek world and flourished in the Roman. The Roman Empire managed to absorb and import these movements into its thinkers and philosophers, and ethos to varying degrees. Hedonism is championed by the Epicureans, that pleasure is the only good, the happy man is the one with many pleasures and few pains. As for the skeptics, they can trace their heritage to Socrates' claim of knowing nothing, his teaching by question and answer. He is the inquirer, much like Lucian the skeptic. Roman society and its massive heterogeneous mix of ideas is perhaps served by the notion of there being no true certainty of reality or truth. As for the Stoics, pleasure is not the measure of happiness or the good. He is in accordance with nature. He fears not poverty or death, only that he should let himself down, to be less than a virtuous man. We will take a look first and foremost at the Stoics. For the Stoic, you cannot control the outer world, but the truly wise man controls himself. He is not cold or uncaring necessarily, but he knows he cannot control all reality. All he cares for is to meet his moral obligations. Greatness is found in that virtue is enough in of itself to free the soul from impure desires. The Roman Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, a slave and an emperor. So we see that social status is irrelevant to the philosophical man. If you are a slave, be a good one. And if you are a king, be a good one too. Emperor Marcus Aurelius stands apart from all previous rulers before him, and most that would come after him. Men who entertained their sensual appetites, whereas he was an absolute ruler who did not let his riches corrupt his mind. He is truly Plato's philosopher king. The idea is not embodied better by any. And yet, as we will see, Marcus Aurelius and the Stoic school is riddled with philosophical problems only Christianity can answer. We will take a look at Marcus Aurelius's achievement, the Meditations, a book written for himself. He is the world's loneliest man, in a sense, the king of the Romans, born into a political, conniving world. The wariness of being a nobleman amidst the violent, smarmy world of Roman politics was so painful. Himself and his soul's upkeep is his only true care. Thus he writes only to himself, to encourage and strengthen his soul. His tumultuous, violent reign, with the Marcomannic Wars and disturbances on the domestic side, could only be tempered by his reflections and introspection into his wisdom. The book is affirmations of the Stoic truths. The first issue we face is that we shall be rebutting Marcus Aurelius on living in accordance with nature. He says that he had learned from Sextus the idea of what it means to live in accordance with nature. If the ultimate good is to live in accordance with nature, living out faithfully the roles the life and universe has given us, it presupposes that the universe is fundamental as deity, and that ethics, morality, and all truth is predicated on this universe. A purely physical universe, that is. This poses several issues. How does a purely physical and perpetual universe give rise to ethical values, personhood? This is impossible. Another issue. Given that the universe is not eternal as per Big Bang cosmology, and given that all contingent things have a cause, there must be something more fundamental than the universe. We will now rebut Marcus on his vague knowledge of the gods. Nor did I sit down to pore over books or work out syllogisms or busy myself with speculations about matters in the heavens, for all these things require the help of the gods and of fortune. Here we see that Marcus trivializes the deities of the Greeks and the Christians, seeing the perfection of deity in a Platonic light, and yet the works of the divine providence is obvious to him. He keeps it an abstract force of the universe, however, denying the true personhood of deity. He writes, "Providence permeates the works of the gods." And elsewhere, "Remember how long you have deferring these things, and how many times you have been granted further grace by the gods." Several issues come up with these quotations. The first, to be granted grace, the sovereign rule of providence, and the works of deity imply a personal divinity, not an abstract Platonic concept of God, and certainly not an impersonal material universe. Marcus makes use of the obvious personality of God when extolling virtues, but waves off the Christian claims and all claims of divinity as speculation when speaking elsewhere. If deity exists as the most fundamental thing that exists, it should be explored deeply, not cheaply waved off as speculation. Marcus Aurelius speaks on the issue of the greatest human error and on justice, but he does so erroneously. The human soul does violence to itself, above all when it becomes, so far as it can, an abscess and a sort of morbid outgrowth on the universe. For to set your mind against anything that happens is to set yourself apart from nature. Again, our soul does violence to itself. We must ask, in light of this, if the God's fundamental deity is the perfect source of virtue and all just, God is our judge, and the ultimate failure is failing God, not ourselves. We are not our own judge as we are imperfect. If the unjust man lives his life of evil, and he were to die, never having received justice at the hands of men, though the Stoics may thirst for justice, he may disgrace his own soul. But how is the divine attribute of justice taking place if there is no concrete personal afterlife? The Stoics cannot answer this successfully. Further, Marcus Aurelius denies the idea of the resurrection of the body and the existence of the soul after death. If souls continue to exist, how does the air contain them from eternity? We must not only think of the bodies that are buried, but also the animals that are eaten by us and the other animals, for these animals that are consumed are also buried in the bodies of those who feed on them. Marcus Aurelius assumes a material ontology of the soul. Thus, the old souls must be dissolved and made into new souls. Yet the rational mind is immaterial, as the only immaterial mind of deity can produce and give rise to the mind seen in humans. There is also the issue of subjective qualia and abstracta, very clearly immaterial things that cannot have their basis in a purely physical, material universe. Despite damage and destruction of the body, if they are to be reconstituted and glorified by God, rather than plainly resurrected as they were when they died, then Marcus Aurelius' critique is foiled. Of course, it wasn't only the Christians that professed a personal afterlife and immaterial soul. It was written by early Christian writer Justin Martyr. The Magi, necromancers, divinations on immaculate children, that is, unborn infants torn from womb, or young kids who are killed and their entrails inspected for revelations from their living soul. Possessions, oracles, and Plato, Homer, Empedocles, Socrates, and Pythagoras all affirm afterlife of sensation and conscious being. Justin Martyr, First Apology. We will now critique the Stoics and their doctrine of predestination and fatalism. Stoic philosophers hold a hard determinist sense of time. All events that take place are predestined. The good is to accept nature and its natural state of the preordained. Acceptance of this is called virtuous. There are several issues with this. The first, what is the point of seeking the virtuous life and condemning the immoral if one's set of values and virtues are predetermined by fate? How is one virtuous if he's merely a robot doing what he's been programmed to do? Similarly, how can one be condemned for evil? If it is virtuous to accept fate and all things it brings about, it is virtuous then to accept the immoral man who refuses to change. Yet Stoics would critique and debate such a man that, ironically, could do no other than what he was fated to do. The Roman orator Plutarch gave a critique of his own. If the Stoic divine principle, that is, their concept of God, predestines all, then the divinity is responsible for evil, an impossibility for perfect, all-good divinity. We will close with an argument from the meta-narrative of the Meditations itself. Marcus Aurelius teaches on virtue, the good, the nature of human suffering, and the ontology of the world, and does so emphatically and dogmatically. Yet for one who is such a strong proponent of the Stoic ideal, he clearly struggled with it. He did not know philosophical peace, otherwise he would not have had to written a book of affirmations and reminders and introspection. His stern ethical concerns and critiques of the Greek polytheistic religion show him a man only partially enlightened, and cannot fundamentally know ethics without knowledge of its source. He realizes the maxims of truth, love, peace, and wisdom, yet denies its source. He enshrines the immaterial, eternal values, and merely backs them up with a physical, material universe as its source. The Logos in Stoicism, the principle of active reason, infuses and directs all of nature. There are fragments existing in humans. With this doctrine, we see that he grasps at the Christian truth of Imago Dei, that is, that we are made in the image of God. And yet he mocks the Christians, who ironically worship the actual Logos, the Word made flesh, the reason come down, Jesus of Nazareth. What philosophy is concerned with truth? The one that vaguely perceives the Logos and reason in mankind, or the one that personally knows the Logos and has kept his wisdom as eternal law, as the Christians do? The Stoics write of the ideal, all-wise Stoic sage, an impossible but sought-after level of wisdom that the Stoic yearns for. Yet we Christians confess and know that the perfect, all-wise sage and teacher does indeed exist. He descended to teach and save mankind, and reigns at the right hand of the Father. We will now take a look at the Epicureans, those who hold the philosophy of Epicurus. This philosophy was influential in the Roman Empire, championed by many such as Lucretius and the great poet Virgil. They rejected metaphysical realism. That is, they were atomists like Democritus, pure physicalists who denied the existence of metaphysical things, very different from philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. For them, matter was made of atoms. Different forms of atoms accounts for the diversity of things that exist in our reality. They exist in the void, an unknowable emptiness that exists as the plane in which the atoms operate. Unlike their atomist predecessors, however, who were hard determinists in terms of fate, the Epicureans argued for a degree of free will, as the atoms could potentially move in unexpected directions. Thus, there is a degree of human agency in Epicureanism. However, the contradiction here is very obvious, how the immaterial mind and abstracta are actually material in their foundation. This is an impossibility. Also, if all is matter and mechanical process, there really cannot be any meaningful notion of a free will or true human agency. Humans are once again rendered nothing more than a mere computer program. For the Epicurean, gods are material entities composed of atoms just like us. The divine are not fundamental sources of reality. Thus, no answer is truly given as to the question of creation of the universe. The Epicureans have no answer. They rejected the immortal soul. For the Epicurean, death is merely a separation of atoms, so death really isn't that profound. It's no different than cutting a table in half. And no real incomposite inner soul exists in us, very different from the Platonists. Epicurean ethics says that the ultimate good is pleasure. They taught hedonism, whereby we are to maximize pleasures and minimize pains. Not necessarily a hedonistic pleasure via immediate temporal pleasure, such as with alcoholics and drug addicts, but rather they argued for pleasure in moderation over excess. Therefore, alcoholism would not be considered good then, despite granting pleasure to a drunkard. Pleasures of mind are said to be the highest good. Absence of pain in long term is the goal. Society upholds justice because it allows for pleasure, not due to some inherent or real value in justice itself. In Epicurean epistemology, they are said to be empiricists. They argued that sense perception corresponds to reality. They were not interested in rational inquiry, speculation of ideas, or universal realities, such as the Platonists. The Epicurean philosophy has several large issues. The first, if all things are essentially the same, made of the same atoms, including gods, how do we account for creation? Whatever form space-time must have been before space-time, and incomposite. Also, how do we account for the universal human experience of the rational mind, given that inquiry brings about social and technological progress? Is it not counterintuitive to dismiss inquiry as good? Plato and Aristotle are far more accurate in this regard. Third is the issue of hedonism. While they admit that normatively a pleasure could be a pain if used without moderation, this is really subjective. One man's pleasure could be another's pain. The plurality of human opinion on pleasure disqualifies us as the standard for the good. Also, if pleasure is the highest good, then qualities such as love, appetite, intelligence, and justice are only good insomuch as they work to bring about pleasure. They are not good in of themselves. Yet given the obvious disagreement and discrepancies over what constitutes pleasure, we can preserve the good only in the perfection of the qualities themselves. We promote justice, for example, not to gain pleasure, but because the virtue is an end on its own. Justice is good, as it is identical with God's being. We say the divinity or God is justice. Thus we can account for the standard by which we judge what is just, and can maintain that despite human disagreements on justice. The good still exists external from us and our subjective experiences. We will now be correcting the philosophers on the attributes and being of the divinity, what is called God. The Roman orator Plutarch said, Moreover, Zeno admits, as Plato does, several virtues with various distinctions, to wit, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, as being indeed inseparable, but yet diverse and different from one another. But again, defining every one of them, he says that fortitude is prudence in executing, justice, prudence in distributing, as being one and the same virtue, but seeming to differ in its relation to various affairs when it comes to action. Plutarch, The Contradictions of the Stoics. In terms of the simplicity and transcendence of God, God, or the good, is incomposite in any way logically. He is equivalent to his attributes. God is love. He is not defined by love as an external arbitrary category, but his attributes are in him and comprise him. The quote by Plutarch shows the notion of conceptual distinctions in an object coinciding with one single ontological reality. Thus, this cannot be said to be called a Christian novelty, or something that the classical theists invented in Christian Europe. Plutarch knew this well. If the universe contains all space and time, whatever formed it has to transcend space-time. Thus we may say that God is immutable. Otherwise there could be a time when he was one way, and another when he was different, an impossibility if he is eternal. If God is perfect, eternal, and immutable, he cannot have deprivations in his qualities. He cannot be evil, as evil is a lack of deprivation of the good, an idea the Neoplatonist only conceived of abstractly, but for the Christian Church we know intimately to be true. The Platonic philosopher Plotinus testifies to the perfect qualities of what he calls the One, growing ever closer to knowledge of the Christian revelation of God, the good and one that the philosophers sought for so long. He says, "The One is perfect because it seeks for nothing and possesses nothing, and has need of nothing, and being perfect, it overflows, and thus its superabundance produces another." Plotinus, from the Aeneads. This stands against the notion of the imperfect gods of the heathens, and against the God indistinguishable from matter, and made of matter, in the opinion of the Stoics. Only the God of the Christian scriptures meets the criteria of the perfect, immutable, pre-existent, and necessary God that is ontologically before and distinct from any and all matter. Greek philosopher turned Christian Justin Martyr writes, "And the Sibyl and Hytaspes said that there should be a dissolution by God of things corruptible. And the philosophers called Stoics teach that even God himself shall be resolved into fire. And they say that the world is to be formed anew by this revolution. But we understand that God, the creator of all things, is superior to the things that are to be changed." Justin Martyr, The First Apology. We will now critique Plato on his cosmology and his doctrine of deity. Plato conceived of a dualism between the material world, that is the realm of becoming, versus the immaterial world of the forms, what he calls the realm of being. The physical is illusory, a shadow of the eternal, immaterial world of forms. While Plato has wise awareness of the fact that the material world is not fundamental or equivalent to deity, his account of creation is quite incomplete and contains obvious difficulties. In his dialogue, the Timaeus, we see that the cosmos or world is not created, but rather formed by the demiurge, who contemplates the eternal world of the forms and manipulates pre-existing but formless matter to form all order. He does not create ex nihilo, that is, from nothing. This fails to account for creation. Why does the universe exist at all? Due to the forms and the demiurge's activity? Why do they exist? The creator must be outside of time and space. Also, logically, the divinity must be simple, and all attributes must be necessarily one and identical with God. So Plato's creator account, and its composite immaterial forms and demiurge and pre-existent matter, cannot be the creator. Plato, writing on the soul, gives testimony to divine prophecy apart from rational inquiry as valid and truth conducive. We read from Socrates, "I will tell you why. I have heard from certain wise men and women who spoke of things divine that..." Now Meno says, "What did they say?" Socrates says, "Some of them were priests and priestesses. There have been poets also who spoke of these things by inspiration, like Pindar and many others who were inspired. They say that the soul of man is immortal, and at one time has an end, which is termed dying, and at another time is born again. From Plato, the Dialogue with Meno. Here Plato clearly affirms the eternality of the soul and the doctrine of inspiration. Thus the biblical prophets have philosophical support in Plato. It is not a religious superstition or novelty, but rather they are revered by Socrates as true wisdom. Plato also affirms divine judgment and a personal afterlife, unlike other philosophers such as the Stoics and Epicureans. And when it arrives at the place where the other souls are, the soul which is impure and has done wrong, by committing wicked murders or other deeds akin to those and the works of kindred souls, is avoided and shunned by all, and no one is willing to be its companion or its guide, but it wanders about alone, in utter bewilderment, during certain fixed times, after which it is carried by necessity to its fitting habitation, that is, gloomy Hades. But the soul that has passed through life in purity and righteousness finds gods for companions and guides, and goes to dwell in its proper dwelling. From Plato's Dialogue, the Phaedo. For if a man, when he reaches the other world, after leaving behind these two claim to be judges, shall find those who are really judges, who are said to sit in judgment there, Minos and Rhadamanthus. From Plato's Apology. The Christian doctrine of hell and paradise are not religious superstitions or novelties, but obvious expressions of divine justice. God is perfect, therefore perfectly just. The divinity must account for judgment. Even some among the pagans understood the reality of divine justice beyond death. Virgil says, "The Avernian grove in the underworld, here Rhadamanthus rules, and most severe his rule is, trying and chastising wrongdoers, forcing confessions from any who on earth went gleefully undetected, but uselessly, since they have only postponed till death their atonement, sat once Siphone, the avenger, scourge in hand, pounces upon the guilty." From Virgil, the Aeneid. Early Christian writer and convert from Greek philosophy, Justin Martyr, sheds light on the fact that many of Plato's ideas were merely a cheap copy of the divine revelation given to Moses by God. We mean the account given through the prophets that Plato borrowed his statement that God, having altered matter which was shapeless, made the world, and that which the poets call a rebus, we know was spoken of formerly by Moses. Concerning the Son of God in the Timaeus of Plato, where he says, "He placed him crosswise in the universe," he borrowed in like manner from Moses, and that Moses, by the inspiration and influence of God, took brass and made it into the figure of the cross, and set it in the holy tabernacle, and said to the people, "If ye look to this figure and believe, ye shall be saved thereby." Which things Plato reading, and not accurately understanding, and not apprehending that it was the figure of the cross, but taking it to be a placing crosswise. And as to his speaking of a third, he did this because he read, as we said above, that which was spoken by Moses, that the Spirit of God moved over the waters. Justin Martyr, from the First Apology. We shall also see Plato's apprehension to declare the actual God and maker of all. Given that the state-enforced execution of Socrates terrified Plato, Plato uses guarded language when speaking of the divinity's true nature. Very critical of the pagan model of polytheism, Plato speaks of the perfect being abstractly, as not to face the wrath of the Areopagus like his teacher. We read, "And he exhorted them to become acquainted with the God who was to them unknown, by means of the investigation of reason, saying, that is neither easy to find the Father and Maker of all, nor having found him is it safe to declare to all." From the Timaeus. Plato therefore holds an incomplete model of creation, no explanation of what made the formless matter that the universe was made from, and an implied personal creator, as with the rational creator entity called the demiurge, with an undefined relation to the equally eternal world of the forms, and without a proper first cause to explain motion and creation. Plato cannot connect the eternal forms to their earthly, carnal manifestation, as the forms would be inert in this sense. Christianity, however, explains the ex nihilo creation, the simplicity and perfection of God as personal and rational, that is, we call him the Logos, and as the ultimate fundamental thing that exists, having aseity, that is, Self-existence. A student of Plato, the philosopher Aristotle very nearly perceives the attributes of the true God. Since anything in motion must be put into motion, and since an infinite causal chain is illogical, he posits that there must be an unmoved mover, a truly fundamental entity prior to all other existence. This substance, whatever it is, must be eternal and not composed of matter. It must be immutable and perpetual, and cannot have potentiality to alter its form or nature, but is pure act. God, or whatever this substance is what he is. He cannot change. He is all that he can be. In Book 8 of the Physics, he notes that the universe's motion and change, its before and after states, require a first principle. Otherwise, the first motion is without an antecedent state. And as the philosopher Parmenides said, nothing comes from nothing. In Book 12 of the Metaphysics, he says, "But if there is something which is capable of moving things or acting on them, but is not actually doing so, there will not necessarily be movement, for that which has a potency needs not exercise it. Nothing, then, is gained even if we suppose eternal substances, as the believers in the forms do, unless there is to be in them some principle which can cause change. Nay, even this is not enough, nor is another substance besides the forms enough, for if it is not to act, there will be no movement. Further, even if it acts, this will not be enough, if its essence is potency, for there will not be eternal movement, since that which is potentially may possibly not be. There must be, then, be such a principle, whose very essence is actuality. Further, these substances must be without matter, for they must be eternal if anything is eternal. Therefore they must be actuality. The Bible teaches the true God that was logically perceived and studied by Aristotle, the first cause and mover of all matter, immaterial, immutable, perfect, distinct yet in full control over the cosmos and all material existence. The God the philosophers ignorantly honored and spoke of only in parts and shadows, the apostles revealed the fullness of. As Paul mentions in Acts, "For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you." This is a call to come to Christ, the fulfillment and perfection of the Logos. All valid philosophy points to and flows forth from him. The opinions of the Greeks are mere imitations and misinterpretations of God's person and attributes. Judgment is very real and is carried out entirely by Christ, the Logos, the reason and wisdom of God, the eternal Jesus Christ. No sophistry will save your soul, and no pagan superstitions or recycling of your soul will come to be, but only Christ, who knows the heart of men. He will judge righteously, standing on the heads of the Greek gods, and humbling the false wisdom of the philosophers. We will end with the words of St. Hippolytus. "For all the righteousness and the unrighteous alike shall be brought before God the Word. For the Father has committed all judgment to him, and in fulfillment of the Father's counsel, he comes as judge whom we call Christ. For it is not Minos and Rhadamanthus that are to judge the world, as you fancy, O Greeks, but he whom the God the Father has glorified, of whom we have spoken elsewhere more in particular, for the profit of those who seek the truth." Against Plato on the Cause of the Universe, by St. Hippolytus. If you are enticed by Greek and Roman philosophy, you must ask yourself a fundamental question. If the wisest of the philosophers, Socrates, said that he knows nothing, and yet it is said of Jesus of Nazareth that he knows all things, which philosophy is wiser, more noble, more fundamental, more perfect? Those which follow the customs of Socrates and all of his inferior thinkers, or that which subscribes to the eternal law of Jesus Christ?